two, 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 two.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Voice TV. Tonight, it's a great pleasure to have a dear guest, Francesca Martinez. Francesca is, as she likes to call herself, a wobbly comedian, writer, performer, and campaigner. In 2014, she wrote her first book, What the Peep Hell is Normal, which has been nominated for 2 national book awards. And she also wrote her first play recently called All of Us, which was supposed to premiere at the National Theatre in London, but it was postponed due to COVID. So we hope we will see it. Well, the people in London will see it soon. Hi, Francesca.
Hello, Maya.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm delighted to join you and see another human being that I'm not related to.
How is the situation there in London? You're in London now.
I'm in London. We're coming out of lockdown quite gradually. And so we've got these 5 steps. And we've just had the most recent step was that our restaurants and cafes had just opened for outside dining. And our gyms are open. Our kids are back at school. So everyone I talk to said it's quite a confusing time because we're really positive about moving back to normality. But also, yeah, what is normal, right? But also, I think a lot of people are a bit anxious about it because we've got quite used to being in our little bubbles. And so the idea of going and mixing more socially now, I think for a lot of people, it feels quite unusual, which is so odd to say. Even me, my life before lockdown was very busy, sociable. I toured a lot. I was on trains, in cars, in theatres. As you mentioned, my play, we were rehearsing that every day for 7 weeks. So to go from that to lockdown was quite an unusual. It was very unusual to live through that change. But now I think the same can be said for perhaps leaving this period of isolation and going back into society. Because I think one of the saddest things I found about the pandemic is the idea that other people are a threat to you or you're a threat to them. Because obviously we're social animals, aren't we? So I found it really kind of sad that during this whole time, our attitude towards each other has become one of fear or danger or anxiety. So I'm really hoping that we'll get back to a time when we can hug and be together without that panic.
Yeah, I know, but for me, when I read the title of your book, I was like, okay, she wrote a book about COVID, because what the hell is normal? We're all thinking about, we're always hearing like the new normal. Are we going back to normal? Are things going to go back to normal? But then I was also similarly to you. We were in really severe lockdown during the spring of now 2020. I don't know which year it is, in Serbia, and we were like in total lockdown in our houses. And for me, it was also unusual how it was really easy to become, in a way, imprisoned, you know, like in 2 weeks, for us, this became the new normality. Like all of us were like, oh, what's happening? As you said, the threat, other virus is coming, danger. And then just 2 weeks later, it became completely normal not to leave your house from 5 p.m. And also the cafes, restaurants, everything stopped. Everything was closed for 2 months. And after a few weeks, I have to say, I started really liking it. Like empty streets, no cafes, no shopping, nothing. You just have to go and take your basic necessities, the things you need, food, come home, cook, calm down. You know, you could read from 5 p.m. You can do whatever you want in your house. You can rest. You can, you know, watch whatever you want. And then when we were back to normal, when we went outside after this lockdown, the first time when the cafes opened and everything was, you know, it was spring, and I really had a panic attack. I felt really more anxious to be in this new freedom than I felt when I was inside. And I was talking to a friend in the park, and I told her, I really feel that now, when they said, okay, now we're free again, that I feel not so free, because when we were locked in our houses, I felt like this is the real freedom. Now I feel capitalism. Now I feel imprisoned because capitalism is doing this to us all the time, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think even though the pandemic's been challenging for a lot of people, and I'm sure we'll get onto that, I feel that in other simple human ways, it's reminded us of the pleasures of basic things like being able to sleep enough. You know, I have friends who work so hard they can't remember the last time they had a lion, and yet this past year they've been able to sleep. They've had time and energy to cook meals rather than eat ready-made frozen ones. Friends with babies have had time to actually see their babies grow up. And so I think in a funny way, the pandemic has also exposed a lot of the basics that we have kind of jettisoned in favor of this frantic, very capitalistic society, which is all about aspiration, competition, go, 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 more, more, more. And actually the pandemic has allowed us a pause to just stop and have time to sleep, to eat proper food, to exercise, to walk in the park on a weekday. So I think there's been a funny kind of contradiction going on between, on the one hand, it's been challenging and scary, but on the other hand, it's kind of given us time. And time is something which so many people don't have. And in a way, it's the most precious thing of all, isn't it? Time on earth, because we all know it's limited and it will run out one day. So I'm hoping that it's kind of reminded us of the core important aspects of life, like health, rest, relationships, nature. And I'm hoping that we'll somehow be able to carry those things on with us when we enter back into societal interaction.
Yeah, and also in your book, I really love the part where you said that you sleep for 12 hours, which is not normal. And then you compared, said, well, Margaret Thatcher slept for 4 hours while she was prime minister. If she slept more, maybe, you know, her politics wouldn't look that way. And then you had this great, like, in this revolution that you call wobbly revolution, you say do less, sleep more. And in a way,
Yeah.
it reminded me also of this time we are living in, you know?
Yeah, well, I realised basically my relationship with sleep is quite a complicated one because I had very serious chronic fatigue in my 20s. And I was forced to stop work for 3 years, and it was very challenging because I was the kind of person who I think aligned some of my self-worth with achievement and productivity, which is a very, I guess, capitalistic notion to align the two. So it really forced me to separate them and to really, I guess, realized how important rest was. And I feel that rest is often so demonized within our society. You know, we're called lazy, there's pressure to work overtime, it's just the norm. And it's almost like a badge of honor if you say, oh, I only get 5 hours of rest tonight. So I found it very difficult to have to kind of reconstruct my views around rest. But I'm very grateful for the chronic fatigue because it actually made me attain a better work-life balance. I don't have physical balance, but I have a better balance in my work life. And I just think it's really important that we don't allow this economic system, which is based on perpetual growth and perpetual consumption, to define the pace in which we live our own lives. I feel really passionately that, you know, we human beings, we have to have cycles of work and play and rest and recuperation. And I was forced to kind of learn that in my 20s, and thankfully I did. So now I feel like an ambassador to sleep. So I'm proud to sleep.
Yeah, but I also loved when you said that if people would sleep more, some people would sleep more, there would be less wars, and there would be, you know, they could not ruin their climate so much. So it really also, in a way, I was thinking about this, that you were now saying the world stopped. And like there were no airplanes, but the planet loved it actually. You know, there were some parts of the earth where you can see things you never saw because of pollution. And I think that this realization that after 1 or 2 or 3 weeks of stopping the world, this what you were saying, this crazy consumption and crazy traveling and everything, that we could really maybe repair the world and the climate before it's really too late.
Well, it's quite an interesting concept, isn't it? When you really look at it, you realize the problems in the world facing humanity are not based on people not doing enough. But that's what's instilled within us from a very young age, you know. You've got to be busy and productive. When actually you realise, actually, if people did less and were more at peace and were more healthy in their own lifestyles, then the world would be healthier. So the problems that we face today come from too much production and too much consumption. So we need to scale back and actually live in harmony with our own rhythm and also the rhythm of the natural world that we all depend on.
Yeah, and also because I think that also there's a problem of us or capitalism making us feel that we have a lack of something all the time, like we have to do something to make ourselves happy, because if we're not pretty enough, if we're not good enough, if we don't have all these things and goods, if we're not rich enough, we cannot feel happy. But now also with this COVID, with the good side of it, we realize that we actually need very little to be happy. Like what you said, some of your
Yeah.
friends lost time, just this small time to be with their family or to be with themselves or to read a book or whatever. So I think
Yeah.
that if all of the people that are completely into this consumption culture, which we all are, would just stop and say, I do not need this to be happy. Like, I do
Yeah.
not need to travel with low cost flights every second week to be happy. No,
Yeah.
because every airplane I take to go to make myself happy in London, Paris, Berlin, wherever, will make the world more polluted, you know. And
Yeah. Well, what you just said is the reason I wrote my book in the first place, because I was born into a world that defined me as abnormal. And as you can imagine, that was hugely disempowering. And it was very difficult for me to actually have self-confidence and self-love. And it took me really questioning society values and realizing, hang on a minute, nobody is normal, and I'm not broken or brain damaged or abnormal. I'm Francesca. I'm perfectly me. So I had to reject society's notions of normality and embrace my own definitions, which is why I call myself wobbly, because wobbly is accurate, but it's also not scary, and I am proud to be wobbly. But when I went through that process myself, I then realised that my battles to like myself had nothing to do with being wobbly and everything to do with living in a culture that breeds self-loathing. And I guess the negativity that so many of us feel towards our own bodies is a product of the culture we live in, which is the culture that fuels dissatisfaction with our bodies and our lives. That's because capitalism depends on us to perpetually consume. And how does it do that? Well, it makes us believe that we're not good enough as we are. And so it constantly undermines us and makes us feel insecure, because you know what? Values that generate well-being for free threaten the culture of consumerism that sustains perpetual growth. So I think it's a political act. It's an act of civil disobedience to love yourself. And
yes,
that's what I call a wobbly revolution. It's both personally empowering, but it's also good for the planet.
yes, and I completely agree with you, because I think that if this really happened and if people really loved themselves as they are, that capitalism would really collapse, because what you were talking about, it in a way functions because people are thinking that they're not good enough. I would love to see clip number 2, which refers to this, which we were talking about from one of your shows.
Okay.
I just
Yeah.
I really felt then and there that suffering had nothing to do with how many fingers or toes you have or how well your body or mind works. It has everything to do with living in a world that doesn't want us to embrace our imperfection. And suffering comes from so many things. But instead of eradicating disabilities, we should be eradicating unhealthy aspirations and superficial values and poverty and inequality and economic injustice. Those are the things that really create poverty in this world and suffering. So I really began to look around me and see, God, you know what? No one likes themselves. Like, even people that I would say are young and beautiful and perfectly able They all hate themselves. And I think this is such a crime. And it made me wonder why. And I realised for our culture to exist, it has to make us believe that we're not good enough. Consumerism can only work if we believe that lie, if we believe that we have to go out and buy things to make us feel better. And I see it as like a giant unhappiness machine pumping out millions of dissatisfied people. So you know what? Accepting yourself as you are is an act of civil disobedience. It really is.
And it really is, in a way. And you were also saying in this concept of this wobbly revolution that we have a problem with capitalism also functioning with dividing us one from the other. And it always reminds me of like this ongoing Cold War where we're fighting against somebody else just because this somebody else is different than you are, not thinking if maybe you can learn something from this person and maybe this person is not so bad, but demonizing the other because he's different. Then it was communism. Now we have, you know, the demonization of China. It's always somebody against somebody, not thinking, aha, so maybe I can learn something from you because you're different than me. No, I'm going to hate you because you're different and I'm going to demonize you. And I also think that the whole situation with the virus has its good side, but also its bad side, where we also have what you were talking about from the beginning of our talk about the other being in a way a threat. And I think that this division between us can be also a big problem in the future, you know, with making this wobbly revolution.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think this system that we currently live in, I think it benefits an elite few. So, I mean, in a short-term sense, because climate change is a threat to everyone. But in the short term, an elite few people hold a lot of wealth and power. And I think the biggest threat to their dominance is unity among everyone else. So they breed discontent and competition and fear of difference in order to keep us divided. And that's because they are so fearful at the prospect of us coming together and realizing all our common humanity and our common goals and everything that we share. Because if people come together, change happens. That's how progress happens. People standing up and believing in better and demanding better. And I think one of the easiest ways of really reducing the possibility of that is to divide and rule. So you sow discontent and fear among the masses so that we're all too busy fighting each other, when what we need to do is come together. And you spoke about the benefit of difference before, and I would agree totally. I think human diversity is beautiful, and I think difference is what makes us learn and grow and evolve and adapt. And if you think about it, human progress has been built on different people having different ideas and approaching subjects and problems with different ways of thinking. So in a sense, our entire human race is here because of difference, both genetically, We know that genetic difference results in stronger beings and stronger immune systems. We know that genetic difference has fueled evolution, you know, just a myriad of different species coming into being. So, and we know that different ideas and thinking out the box and innovation, that it comes from difference. So I feel that we owe our whole lives to difference, and yet we've ended up in a culture that demonizes it. So there's a really big disconnect there. And I think we need to really, really fight this very strongly, because it has very serious implications. And unless we do come together very soon as one human family to address the huge problems climate change presents, unless we start acting like a global family, our very existence and future is going to be a threat. So I really think the question of embracing human diversity is one of utmost importance, and our survival may depend on it.
But are you optimistic now when we see the whole situation with the COVID crisis and all the vaccines, and how the countries, our European countries were not during the crisis, they didn't show this kind of solidarity and this kind of what you were saying, like a global networking. And I think that this crisis just showed that everybody in a way did not embrace the other countries, but more closed into nation states. And I think for me, it's really not so encouraging to think that this whole crisis showed that we are more divided than ever and more unwilling to help the other. And I'm not sure how we will come out of this as better people, as we showed like a collective, like humanity, that we are not at all good. And still you have poor countries with no vaccines, with no healthcare, richer countries closing it themselves, not wanting to help. So do you see, and after the whole crisis we had with the war in Syria, now this crisis, and we didn't see Europe, which was supposed to be like a place of progressive thought, doing anything good. So are you optimistic or pessimistic in this vision of the future after this?
That's a very big question. I think what you've highlighted there is you've highlighted the fact that capitalism cannot solve global issues, because one of the core logics of capitalism is this notion of competition between people, between countries. So economically, each country is kind of structured to look after its own needs. And of course, you get a global pandemic coming along. And what does that require? That requires global solutions. That requires a global vaccine rollout. And of course, that's really, I guess we could say that it contradicts the logic of like self-serving capitalism, because it requires an attitude of we're all in this together and we're all going to make sure that the entire population can access this vaccine. Now, I think the likelihood is that the richer countries will try and vaccinate their populations, ignore the poorer countries, and then further down the line realise that's not going to work, and reluctantly at that point maybe extend that privilege to the rest of the world. But I think it will be done in a reluctant way. It won't be done when it should be done, which, as you say, is now, because it's just obvious, it's common sense that this is a global issue. And like climate change, we need to address it on a very holistic scale. So I think if you ask me whether I'm positive or optimistic about the future of the human race and whether I think we'll be able to come together and actually break down these toxic notions of nation states and the notions that certain economies matter and others don't. I think the battle is on. I think this is an age-old battle between the many and the few. And I think environmentally, it doesn't look good. We've got a window of perhaps 10 years to really turn the tank around and do a huge about turn and transform the way we live and the way we work. Now, the solutions are there. We can do it. Solutions aren't the issue. The issue is that our political establishment are so invested in this dirty way of living and so determined to hang on to our wealth and power. That is the biggest obstacle to progressive change. Do I think we can achieve change? All I can say is people around the world give me hope. Individuals who dedicate their lives to fighting for a better planet. You've got young people like Greta Thunberg. You've got DM's own Yanis Varoufakis. These are people that dedicate every day to trying to address inequalities and demand that we live in a more sustainable way. And while there are people like that around, I have to have hope.
Yeah. Well, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I read this great text by Franco Bifo Berardi, who was talking about the world, the future of the world. And he said that for him, there were two options. One is that we go into total techno-totalitarianism, and the other one was that we would start living a useful kind of society where we would do only the things we have to do, like a more sustainable like society. And I was thinking about this topic, the first one, because it looked more as this reality we're living in. And I was thinking that after this crisis, this state control and of course the global surveillance and everything we knew about before this became even worse during the pandemic. Of course, we started also using the internet much more, and we became completely dependable of the internet. We, as you said, we're not hugging each other, seeing each other in person. We are becoming used to this kind of communication. Yes. So do you think that it would be possible to make this kind of a global revolution where we would realize that we have to live in a different kind of way without being together in person, and also with being in a way constantly monitored and controlled? So do you think that that we will be on the streets after this, or we will be much more like, you know, with our gadgets, with our phones, and of course more controlled than ever?
You know, I think it's an interesting question. I think technology can both benefit and impinge progress. I think obviously it can connect people and aid communication. And that is a brilliantly beneficial tool in terms of building mass support and mass movements. And I think, yes, it's going to be integral moving forward, in the sense of it can bring people together all over the world. And during the pandemic, we've seen the launch of the Progressive International, which was a great example of connecting progressives around the world. And I watched that with a lot of excitement, and I felt really inspired. Like, there are people all over the world who are fighting for these values every day, and the fact that we're able to connect with each other in this way is hugely important. I have to say, one of the biggest things I think facing humanity in terms of problems is, I have a theory, and that theory is this: I think that the people who get into power are often the most egotistical, power-hungry, insecure, devious people around. And I think one of the reasons we're in such a mess is because the worst of humanity are elevated into powerful positions. And the people that you actually would want in powerful positions, the people actually with a genuine desire to serve others, they're not interested in attaining power. So often you get people who are just, going along, serving their communities and being brilliantly principled and full of integrity, but they don't have any drive or ambition for power. And then in my lifetime, when I have actually met people in power, I always come away thinking, oh, you're the kind of person who is driven to power because of ego, because of selfish aims and goals. And you're the kind of person that would do anything to get power. And I think this is a really crucial problem for humanity. I think until we manage to break that cycle and elevate people with far more humane values and who are driven by real integrity and like the moral ambition to make the world better for everyone, I think we're going to struggle with real progress.
Yeah, but this is a great point that you made, because I was also thinking about that in my country, in Serbia. We have a problem that now we have this really terrible government that is now completely in power. They have 70% of all the vote. But the big problem is that we don't have an adequate opposition. We don't have young people that want to take power in their hands. But I was thinking, why was that? Why don't I or my friends want to go into politics in Serbia or anywhere else? And I think it's a problem of the system, of the political system. Nobody wants to be a part of a political system that has power and that in a way is very hierarchical and capitalistic and very patriarchal in the worst sense of this word, because you have a system that you cannot break by being someone with humanist values. You come inside the system, it will eat you alive, and that's the problem. That I don't think that it's I think it's a structural problem, and at the end that first we have to, in a way, I think that capitalism also has to go together with the whole system of values that it made, this web of structures. I'm not sure that we can go to places and that already exist in this existing structure and make the things better. That's the problem, I think.
I know there have been societies in the past, for example, who have done they've appointed public officials through random, like a jury. You're just randomly picked. And I think while that might not be perfect, it definitely gets around the problem of a certain type of person seeking power all the time. Like I think it could address the issue of spreading power out to people who aren't that interested in dominating others and assuming power. So I think I would like to see society trying to address this issue a lot more, because I think it's rarely spoken about, but I think it's really, it has huge ramifications, and I feel like we're living in a dysfunctional world of crazy leaders. And so that's what I feel. I feel that if you want to create a kinder, fairer world, you have to have kinder, fairer leaders.
Or not leaders at all. That's also a thing. Maybe we don't need leaders. And I think that this, power to the people, it means that we really have this kind of a society that doesn't depend on one person, and that doesn't look like this, but rather like
I think
model.
I agree. I think policy, for example, is much more important than a person. But I think in our current world, it's all about personality politics, and it should be about policy.
Yeah. And I wanted to see a clip. It's clip number 3, because we're all talking about the economic crisis that, of course, started, but it will be worse and worse. And we will probably face a very difficult situation in the next couple of years. This is a show you were in. It was before COVID, in 2019. You were talking about austerity in Britain. So I just wanted to see the clip, and then we can talk a little bit about that.
And I don't know if this is widely reported, but austerity has caused the death of over 130,000 human beings in Britain. That is absolutely outrageous. That's 130,000 mums, dads, daughters, sons, uncles, aunts who've died because the Tories and the Lib Dems decided to make ordinary people pay for a crash caused by bankers who we bailed out. My final point, as a wobbly woman, I really have to highlight the tens of thousands of disabled people and sick people who have died after being found fit for work. Now, we are one of the richest countries in the world, and this is absolutely outrageous. Even the UN has called Tory welfare reform a violation of disabled people's rights. So I want to remind everyone here that anyone can become disabled or sick at any time. And right now, this government is taking away the safety net that we have fought for collectively over decades to help those in need. And I think whatever your politics, you can agree that punishing disabled people and sick people for falling on hard times is absolutely morally wrong, and they have blood on their hands.
So this was your opinion on the situation then in 2019. It was before COVID and before the COVID crisis. What do you think now? So 2 years later, 1.5 years later, how is the situation now, and what do you think will happen with the economy in the future?
Well, COVID has really highlighted existing inequalities in Britain and I'm sure everywhere. And we recently heard that disabled people had made up 2/3 of the COVID deaths last year. So in 2020, 2/3 of people who died from COVID were disabled. Now, this has barely been remarked upon in the media, and it's been shocking to see the silence surrounding this. And I think it really exposes the fact that some people within our society are viewed as expendable. And I think this is a very awful and disgusting way to view humanity. And we live in a world that reduces human beings to economic units. You know, it ties someone's worth to how productive they are. And I think we've really seen the kind of results of this play out within the pandemic, with the kind of attitude that, oh, maybe the vulnerable should just shield. But that's presuming the vulnerable are just a homogeneous mass that exists separately from society. Vulnerable people are intertwined with everybody. You know, they have families, they have friends, they have colleagues. So I think it's really shone a light on how much we have to redefine what people's worth should be tied to. And I really believe that everybody on this planet, regardless of disability, gender, economic status, sexuality, religion, everybody is worthy of being treated with dignity and respect. But I think we're really in danger of having austerity foisted upon us again. I think since 2008, we've seen austerity used as the reason we need austerity is because we're broke, there's no money left. So austerity is being used. But the real reason behind austerity is to transfer public money into private hands. And I saw Yanis Varoufakis describe it as class war. Austerity is class war. It's ideological, and it has no basis in logic, really, because austerity's never worked historically. So when you have times of recession, times of financial hardship, you need to invest more. You know, all the economic models say this is the basic economics. The way out is to invest. And instead, we've had this narrative that what we actually need to do is cut public spending. And that means we need to cut all the things that are viewed as luxuries and expendable, like welfare spending and NHS spending and public services spending and education. And I think any sane person goes, hang on a minute, these are luxuries, these are the core pillars of civilization. You take away good education and quality healthcare and support networks for when people become ill, sick. And what are we left with? Who are we? What are we spending money on? So in the last decade or so, I've lived in a society that has demonized needing help. It's demonized being a benefit claimant. But I want to say that actually, when you look into the numbers, these cuts aren't about saving money. And I'll give a very brief example. So the government have brought in huge cuts to disability benefits. And this was under the guise of cutting fraud, even though fraud was under 0.5%. And in the last 2 years, the government has spent £120 million of taxpayers' money fighting benefit appeals in court. And they've lost 3/4 of them. So they are wasting hundreds of millions of pounds trying to deny people who are rightfully entitled to benefits. This is where they're choosing to spend all that money. On top of that, they're taking away people's ability to work and be productive and pay tax, because they're taking away their support that they need, whether it be extra and a car or carers or helpers. They're withdrawing that support. So I realised that it's not really about saving money. And I think what it is about is I think it's about trying to change the culture we live in and create a society where there is no expectation of welfare, there's no social responsibility, and no support network. Basically, we do not help each other. And if you fall on hard times, you're on your own. And that's a society like America. And I don't want to become that society. As a taxpayer, I'm really proud to fund welfare and to help people lead independent and dignified lives. I can't think of anything better to spend money on. So I think this is really, we're living in a kind of, we've got ideological warfare going on. They're trying to redefine what it is to be human, what matters to us. And I think economics is often presented as something that most of us can't understand, and it's so complicated, and it's a science, and we should leave it to the experts. But actually, economics is about answering questions of priority and morality. You know, who do we support? Who do we give money to? Who don't we give money to? And I think the very nature of politics is the question of how do we treat each other? So I think that's the heart of what's going on at the moment. And I think the values that so many of us hold dear, the values of collective endeavour and working together and caring about each other, I think they're really under attack right now. And we need to rise up and we need to resist and say, no, we are proud of our humanity and we want to be the kind of country and the kind of society that looks after each other. Because to me, if you look at the history of humanity, we've come so far because of cooperation and because of our adaptability and because of our willingness to work together. And currently, we live in a neoliberal economic system that tells us that we're all individual units and that notions such as society don't exist and we should just look after our own. But I think that flies in the face of the core part of being a human being, which is a recognition that we're all on this planet for a short amount of time and we need to come together. And it may sound like sentimental, but that's what we're going to have to do if we want to have a future which isn't blighted by war and inequality and climate change. And I just think, as human beings, that, you know, human existence is such a gift, and it should be a beautiful thing to get a life as a human being. But so often our political system turns that life, that existence, into just a struggle for survival on this planet. And I just think we could do so much better, and we could be like a haven of creativity and connection within this dark black universe.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I wanted to ask you, because you live in London, and it's going to be now 2 years that Julian Assange is imprisoned in the Belmarsh prison, and still not knowing what is going to happen with him and his situation. How do you feel about that, and how do people in Britain feel about him being imprisoned for so long with all the problems he is facing, being extradited to America, and what is the situation with his case in Britain? How do you feel about it?
I think a lot of people feel that he's being held up as an example. And this is such a big and important case, because it really is going to define how journalists are treated everywhere. So here we have a man who dared to expose the crimes of the powerful. And I think the powerful really want to show what happens to people who do that. So this is much more than about Julian Assange, one man. This is about our ability to have a free, independent media, to have journalism that actually holds the powerful to account. There is a lot on the line here. If Julian Assange is extradited, we all know what will happen to him in America. And we all know the signal that it's going to send out to other journalists and other whistleblowers around the world. And I think whatever your views on Julian Assange as a person, and I know a lot of progressives have different issues with him, I think they're not relevant to this issue. And I think we have to come together and really resist the pressures to extradite him, because I think if he is extradited, we could see a real decline in journalism, which is brave enough to go into those areas which are deemed off topic and taboo. And already there are very few journalists brave enough to go there. So we need to fight tooth and nail to ensure that that is protected, because you know what? A healthy democracy needs a healthy media. It needs people who are holding the powerful to account. And we already have very few of the caliber of journalism that is actually doing that to the powerful. And so my fear is, if we don't fight hard enough in this Assange case, then we're going to lose a much bigger battle ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to read a short quote from your text, The Wobbly Revolution, and maybe finish off with it, because I like it very much. So I'll read it now. To acknowledge that someone who can't work because of their disability is still entitled to a dignified life is anti-capitalist. To believe that a person's worth should not be determined by their economic productivity is anti-capitalist. to believe that everyone, regardless of gender, race, religion, ability, sexuality, economic background, should have access to food, shelter, healthcare, and education is anti-capitalist. To prioritize nourishing relationships and rewarding work over materialistic goals is anti-capitalist. To love ourselves and care for one another is anti-capitalist.
Yeah, I think most people, they might not know it, but most people are anti-capitalist at heart, because capitalism is entirely incompatible with basic moral human values.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Thank you, Francesca, so much for being our guest tonight at Voice TV, and I hope we will have a chance to speak again.
Thank you, Maya. It's been an absolute pleasure, and let's hope that we can continue the wobbly revolution.
Yes, I would love that. I would really love us to have a wobbly revolution in the future more than ever.